Imagine being the most overlooked guy in class. Plain face, zero standout qualities, absolutely nothing that makes you memorable. Or at least that's what everyone thinks. Because underneath that average guy exterior, Ayato Amagiri is hiding something most people couldn't even fathom. He's one of the most brutal swordsmen alive. And the best part? Nobody knows it. Nobody except him. But Ayato didn't come to Seidokan Academy for fame or glory. He came looking for answers. His older sister Haruka studied there years ago, and one day she just vanished. No trace, no explanation. So he decided to walk the same halls she once did, blending in as just another student. No attention, no suspicion. The perfect plan. It lasted exactly 0 days, because on his very first day, before he even made it to class, he ended up jumping through the window of a girl's dorm room. Not for the reason you're thinking. He found a handkerchief and was trying to return it. What he didn't account for was that the room's owner, Julis Alexia von Riesfeld, would actually be inside and barely dressed. Julis looked at him, he looked at her, and they both knew this wasn't going to end well. Ayato explained what happened, and surprisingly, she actually listened, even thanked him with a smile. Sweet moment, you might say. Brief moment, someone else might add. Because 2 seconds later, Julis activated her powers and the entire room turned into a walking furnace. Ayato didn't wait for the flames to reach him. He bailed the same way he came in, straight outside. She followed immediately and threw a duel in his face. The terms were simple. If he won, she'd accept it was all a misunderstanding. If she won, his fate would be in her hands. Ayato tried to get out of it by claiming he had no weapon, but the crowd that had already gathered around them wasn't letting him off that easy. Someone tossed him a sword from the crowd, and just like that, he had no excuse. Julis opened the fight by blasting fire lances at him one after another. Ayato cut through and dodged them with a calm that had absolutely nothing ordinary about it. Julis, frustrated that not a single attack was landing, charged up her most powerful strike, a massive fireball big enough to swallow him whole. What she didn't expect was that Ayato wasn't going to step back. Instead, he launched himself straight at the fireball. Julis detonated it mid-air, thinking that would stop him, but he was already inside the flames, cutting straight through without slowing down. When he came out the other side, the blade was already at her throat. Julis tried to counter, but it was too late. He took her down, and just as she was about to call him out for getting too cocky, she noticed Ayato wasn't even looking at her. His eyes were locked somewhere else. When Julis followed his gaze, everything clicked. Someone had tried to take her out during the duel. An arrow was flying straight at her, and he had tackled her to the ground to get her out of its path. Just like that, no drama, no big speech. He'd saved her life. And how did Julis repay him? By causing a scene, obviously, because on top of everything, Ayato's hand had ended up somewhere very unfortunate. The scream she let out was enough to kill every conversation within a 20-foot radius, and before things could spiral any further, Claudia Enfield, student council president, stepped in and declared the duel invalid on the grounds that Ayato hadn't even completed his official registration yet. In her office, Claudia welcomed the new student and broke down how the academy worked. Seidokan students competed in tournaments called Festas against 5 other schools in the city. The problem was their academy had been putting up terrible results for years, and she needed someone to change that. Ayato listened to all of it, but his very first question wasn't about the tournaments or the prizes. It was about Haruka. Claudia searched the records and found almost nothing. Haruka had been enrolled 5 years ago, dropped out after 6 months, and nearly all her files had been wiped from the system. The only thing that survived was a combat log for a weapon called the Servaresta, a sword with no formal lending record but with battle data from that same time period. Claudia apologized for not having more. Ayato told her not to worry, that his sister was no longer his only reason for being there. "Then what's the other one?" she asked. "Finding out what I'm actually worth," he replied. Claudia took that in, didn't push further, and let him know that, like all students, he had the right to request an OrgaLux weapon. Ayato asked for the Servaresta. She said she'd arrange it and handed him a temporary weapon in the meantime. Then, almost casually, she admitted she'd lied about the incomplete registration just to get him out of the mess with Julis. Ayato wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or watch his back around her. In class, Ayato got seated right next to Julius, who received the news with all the warmth of a broken freezer. After class, Ayato asked if they could start fresh and get along. She told him she'd rather shave off her eyebrows than be his friend, turned around and left. The guy sitting behind Ayato, Aishiro Yabuki, told him to not take it personally. That's just how Julius was with everyone. Walking back to the dorms, Aishiro filled him in on the basics. She was the crown princess of Lysultania, and despite that, she'd chosen to enroll at the academy and grind her way up the rankings, duel after duel, until she reached 5th place school-wide. Why she was doing it? That was something only Julius could answer. They didn't have to wait long to see her in action. On their way out, they found her in an argument with a guy who clearly spent more time in the gym than hitting the books, Lester McPhail, 9th in the rankings, trying to force her into accepting a duel. Julius refused. He kept pushing, and when she tried to walk away, Lester grabbed her arm hard enough that her handkerchief dropped to the ground. That was enough to set her off. Before things fully exploded, Ayato stepped in. One of Lester's guys recognized him as the same dude who had already fought Julius that morning, and Lester shifted his focus. But when Aishiro pulled out his phone to record, the people around Lester convinced him it wasn't a smart move. He backed off, but not before throwing Julius a warning on his way out. Before going their separate ways, Julius told Ayato to watch himself. He ignored that and instead asked Julius directly, why would a princess put herself through all of this? Julius was more honest than he expected. She needed money, a serious amount of it, and the only realistic way to get it was to win the Phoenix Festa. The tournament was a pairs format, and she still didn't have a partner. When Aishiro asked what kind of ally she was looking for, she rattled off a list of requirements so long and specific that both guys just looked at each other, not sure to laugh or run. The next morning, during his run, Ayato asked Julius to show him around the city as payback for saving his life. Julius agreed, reluctantly, and they set a date for when they both had a free day. Back in class, Ayato greeted Julius when he walked in. What nobody expected was for her to actually greet him back. The silence that followed was dead serious. Julius had to remind the whole class that she wasn't some kind of exotic animal on display. It was then that Ayato noticed the blue-haired girl sleeping peacefully in the seat next to him. When she woke, he recognized her immediately, Saya Sasamiya, his childhood friend. 5 years without seeing each other, and she was still exactly the same, laid back, half asleep, and brutally straightforward. She told him her dad enrolled her at the academy so his new weapons could get real combat exposure. The teacher walked in shortly after, and spotting Saya, asked why she'd missed class the other day. The teacher laughed it off and gave her a light tap on the head. While Ayato was teasing Saya for being the same slacker she'd always been, Julius watched from her seat with an expression anyone would have mistaken for jealousy. So much so that the second class ended, she went to fix herself before coming back to stake her claim. The city tour was her thing with Ayato, not anyone else's. Saya, completely unbothered, offered to handle it herself. Julius pushed back, Saya held her ground, and they kept going back and forth until Claudia showed up. Claudia slid right up next to Ayato, very deliberately, and pointed out that seniority was the criteria, the tour was hers. That was all it took for Julius and Saya to drop their beef and shut her down together. Claudia played up the heartbreak, handed Ayato the paperwork to pick up the serveresta, and let him know that the compatibility test with the weapon was scheduled for the next day. Then, almost casually, she admitted she'd lied about the incomplete registration just to get him out of the mess with Julius. Ayato wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or watch his back around her. Ayato, not wanting to referee another war, slipped away using the excuse of grabbing drinks. The second he was gone, Saya got straight to the point, asking Julius why she was doing her the favor of the tour if she couldn't stand people. Julius admitted Ayato had saved her life during the duel. Saya raised an eyebrow and asked how the fight actually ended. Julius said Claudia had called it off. Saya got quiet for a second, then said something that hit Julius like a bucket of ice water, that Ayato was operating on a completely different level, and if that duel had actually finished, the outcome wouldn't have been clean for either of them. Julius didn't accept that. She challenged Saya to a duel on the spot to prove a point. They didn't even get to the opening stance. Before either of them could move, 2 arrows cut through the air and grazed right past them. Jules recognized them instantly, identical to the ones someone had fired at her during her fight with Ayato. She spun toward where they came from, spotted a hooded figure, and launched fire straight at them. The flame was heading right on target until a second hooded figure appeared out of nowhere and deflected it. These weren't random attackers, there were two of them, and they very deliberately did not want Jules making it to the Phoenix Festa. Just as things couldn't get more intense, Saya decided to handle the situation her way, and her way was pulling out a Lux grenade launcher the size of her entire torso and opening fire without hesitation. The hooded figures weren't expecting that. Nobody was expecting that. The problem was that one of the shots didn't land exactly where it's supposed to, and the fountain right next to them paid the price. The blast soaked both of them head to toe in under 12 seconds, and all either of them could do was stand there, somewhere between furious and completely defeated. When Ayato came back with the drinks, he walked into the full picture. Two girls soaking wet, a fountain completely destroyed, and an awkward silence hanging in the air. Jules, still processing the disaster, turned to Saya and asked something she'd clearly been holding back for a while: why she wasn't wearing a bra. Saya looked at her dead serious and replied that her body hadn't quite reached the point where that was necessary. Jules had no comeback. Neither did Ayato. The next day, Ayato showed up at the weapon testing area with Claudia and got his first surprise of the day when he found Lester already there, not as a spectator. Claudia calmly informed him that Lester was also there to claim a weapon. Ayato felt his stomach drop when he saw Lester step up in front of the exact same sword he'd come for, the Servaresta. The rule was clear: if compatibility didn't clear 80%, the weapon simply wasn't yours. Claudia and Ayato watched as Lester planted himself in position and dumped every ounce of his energy into the weapon. The numbers climbed, dropped, climbed a little, dropped again. It was like watching someone try to convince a cat to follow orders. Claudia said quietly that this type of weapon didn't respond to raw power. Ayato asked how she knew that. She smiled and mentioned she had her own OrgaLux, which said plenty about her understanding of weapons like this. Lester, fed up with the results, dropped all subtlety and literally tried to force the sword into submission. Massive mistake. The Servaresta didn't just reject the attempt, it launched him straight into the wall with a force that left no room for debate. The compatibility rating nosedived into the negatives. They advised him to stop before the weapon did something worse. Then it was Ayato's turn. What nobody expected was that the Servaresta didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat for him either. It attacked him. The weapon activated on its own and came straight at him like it had unfinished business. Ayato had to pour all his focus into containing it, moving, responding, searching for the weapon's rhythm instead of fighting against it. And little by little, something shifted. The weapon's resistance began to give way, almost as if it was putting him through a test. When the compatibility locked in and the numbers pushed toward 100%, even Claudia was speechless. That night, Ayato went to Claudia's room. She told him she had something important to show him. After offering him a seat, she opened a file with the records of every student who had registered for the Phoenix Festa. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Over the past few weeks, one by one, participants had been forced to withdraw due to injuries, some accidents, some incidents with no clear witnesses. Nobody had been able to prove anything. Ayato asked if they'd been attacked the same way Jules had. Claudia said there was no direct evidence, but that Lester and one of his close associates, a guy named Randy, had no alibi for when the attack on her took place. They were the most obvious suspects, even if obvious didn't always mean right. Then she asked him for something. Stay close to Jules. Not as a formal guard, no title, no protocol. Just be there in case someone tried something again. Ayato asked why she didn't assign someone else. Claudia looked him straight in the eye and told him that Jules tolerated very few people and that he was part of that shortlist, even if she'd never admit it herself. A few days later, Ayato and Jules met up for the city tour they'd promised. After walking around, they stopped to eat, and that's when Ayato carefully brought up the attacks. He suggested she avoid moving around alone. Jules heard him out and dismissed it in the same breath. She had zero intention of hiding or changing her routine because of someone who couldn't even show their face. The moment got cut short when Lester and his crew showed up and interrupted without any warning. Jules told them to get out of the way.
Lester ignored it and came right back with his usual agenda. He wanted a duel. He wanted to prove who was on top. Ayato looked at him, let a second pass, and told him with complete calm that he was acting like someone whose IQ was too small even for cartoons. Lester's blood boiled, but his crew reeled him in before he did something he couldn't walk back. On the way home, the peace lasted exactly as long as it took them to run into a group of students from La Wolf Academy. At first, it looked like a conflict between themselves. Looked like it because the moment Julius and Ayato stopped to watch, the entire group turned towards them. The trap was clumsy but effective if you didn't see it coming. Julius saw it coming. She drew her weapon and cut through all of them in a matter of minutes. No sweat, no break in her form. She left only the one who seemed to be in charge standing, grabbed him and asked who had hired them. The guy gave it up fast and pointed toward the nearby trees.
There, between the shadows, was the hooded figure again. Julius took off running before Ayato could tell her to wait. He went after her. The problem was the figure had led them exactly where it wanted, deeper into the woods, away from any witnesses, completely surrounded. A blade passed so close to Julius's neck it nearly grazed her skin. Ayato shouted a warning when he spotted someone aiming at her, but the attackers had already shifted targets. The shot came for him instead. He deflected it with his weapon at the last second. Right after that, the hooded figures vanished into the trees like they'd never been there at all. Julius, standing among the ferns, went off on him for putting himself in the line of fire. He listened without arguing, even though they both knew perfectly well who had ignored the original warning. That night, Julius invited him to her room. When she told him to take off his shirt, Ayato stopped dead, and his brain immediately went somewhere completely wrong. Julius shut that down with surgical coldness. She was going to sew up the tear his shirt had taken in the fight, not star in some melodrama. Ayato settled down and let her work. While she sewed, he noticed a photograph on the table. Girls smiling at the camera with the look of people who don't have much but don't need it to be happy. He asked if they were her friends. Julius lowered her voice a little and told him how she'd met them. One day, she'd slipped out of the palace and ended up lost in the lower districts. A group of guys had cornered her, and it was those girls living in an underfunded orphanage who got her out of it and brought her home. After that, every escape from the palace ended up there with them. Over time, she found out the orphanage was on the verge of shutting down from lack of funding, and that's when she decided to enroll at the academy, climb the rankings, win duels, and send everything she could to keep that place running. The handkerchief Ayato had returned on that very first day, the one that kicked off everything that followed, had been a gift from those girls. It was the closest thing to home that Julius carried with her. The next morning, Julius found a letter in her locker. She read it once, folded it, and walked out of the building like she had a clock running in her head. Ayato and Yabuki spotted her pass through the hallway and had no idea what to think until Claudia arrived. When Yabuki mentioned the letter, the three of them reached the same conclusion almost simultaneously. It was from the attacker. Ayato asked why Julius hadn't said anything. Claudia answered that she'd probably wanted to keep them out of something she felt was hers alone to deal with. Ayato didn't say another word. Claudia had already seen it coming, so she pulled out the server Esta, held it out to him, and stepped back. He took it and ran. Julius reached the location the letter had specified and found Silas Norman, one of the guys from Lester's circle. She wasn't surprised. The past few days had given her enough pieces to put the whole picture together. He was the one behind everything. Just as she was drawing her weapon, Lester showed up from the other direction, confused and worked up, holding a letter of his own that said Julius had challenged him to a duel. Silas didn't bother denying it. He calmly explained that he'd sent both letters, drawn them both there, and that his plan was to eliminate them on the spot and let all the blame fall on Lester. 2 birds, 1 stone. Lester exploded and launched himself at him, but one of the combat puppets Silas controlled blocked the axe before it could land. The man had an entire collection of those things, and every time one went down, he called up another. Lester fought with everything he had, but for every puppet he destroyed, 3 more appeared. Julius hit them from fire from another angle, but couldn't take them down fast enough. Silas watched from the back and started talking too much, the way people do when they think they've already won. He told Julius it was over.
She told him to shut up, and almost as an aside, mentioned she already knew he'd been hired by Alakant Academy. Silas froze. That wasn't in his script. He said that if she knew too much, he couldn't let her walk out of there. And then the ground crocked. The air split. Two puppets dropped in pieces without anyone visibly touching them. Ayato was standing in the middle of the scene, Serveresta lit up, and before Silas could react, he already had Julius out of the kill zone and in his arms. Julius looked at him and started laying into him for getting involved in something that wasn't his problem. He told her she was right, it wasn't his obligation, but she fought to protect people she cared about, and yet no one had ever done the same for her. So that someone was going to be him. Julius didn't finish her response because Silas remembered he still had an army of puppets and that the emotional moment could wait. Ayato held Julius with one arm and swept the field clean with the other. Silas threw out his last card, a massive lumbering figure with more bulk than sense. Ayato didn't even blink. He dismantled it in 2 moves. Silas activated a flying puppet and tried to escape through the air. He didn't get very far. Julius knocked him down from below, and Ayato finished him off before he hit the ground. Silas survived the fall. Genestella don't go down that easy, but the second he looked up, he found Claudia waiting for him with a smile that promised absolutely nothing good. He ran. He didn't get far. Claudia handed him off to Yabuki with clear instructions: find out everything he knew about Alakant and keep the whole thing quiet. Yabuki, sharp as always, asked if the plan was to use that information to hold Alakant in their debt. Claudia didn't answer. Her silence was answer enough. Meanwhile, on the other side of the academy, Ayato was walking fast toward a meeting point when he accidentally bumped into a girl with her head down. They both apologized at almost the same time. The girl had silver hair and a gaze that mixed calm with something that felt like constant tension just beneath the surface. Her name was Kirin Toto. The moment was brief. An older man waiting a few feet away raised his voice at her for making him wait. Kirin hurried off without finishing the conversation. Ayato watched her go and couldn't shake the feeling that something about that scene sat wrong with him. In the following training sessions, Julius made it clear that Ayato's arrival hadn't made her any calmer or more patient. She came at him with an intensity that didn't leave room for breaks, pressuring every angle, cutting off every opening he tried to use. Ayato held on, barely, but he held on, and when it was over, neither of them went into too much detail about how it ended. Afterward, with the energy settled, they sat down to talk strategy for the Phoenix Festa. Julius was direct. Ayato needed to stay out of unnecessary duels before the tournament. Every fight he took was information the enemy could use to anticipate them. They needed to arrive at the Festa without anyone knowing exactly what they were capable of. The conversation got cut short when Saya and Lester walked in. Saya read the room, looked at Julius, looked at Ayato, and announced without missing a beat that it looked like a private adults-only training session. Julius kicked her out, and they started up again. Ayato and Lester ignored them with the shared expression of two people who had already learned not to get involved. That's when Lester, without looking at him directly, without dropping his usual front, muttered something that sounded like a thank you for what had gone down with Silas. It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't emotional, but it was real, and Ayato took it for exactly what it was. Then the door opened again. Claudia walked in with two people nobody was expecting: Ernesta Kuhn and Camilla Pareto, students from Alakant Academy. She introduced them as the engineers behind a joint project between both schools to develop a new Lux weapon: professional, organized, diplomatic. What was none of those things was what Ernesta did next. She walked straight up to Ayato with an energy that had no business being in any academic setting, whispered something in his ear that nobody else caught, and kissed him on the cheek before anyone could react. The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it took Julius and Saya to draw their weapons. Camilla tried to apologize for her partner with a calm that spoke to a lot of practice dealing with exactly this kind of situation. But while she did, her eyes drifted to the weapons Saya was carrying. She examined them, praised them with genuine technical knowledge, and then, almost in the same breath, began pointing out their flaws one by one with the precision of someone who enjoyed being right a little too much. Saya looked at her. Camilla looked back. And just like that, it was clear that a rivalry had been born without needing a single formal duel. Camilla hadn't even finished listing the weapon's shortcomings when Saya raised her voice and made it clear that every word coming out of her mouth was a direct insult to her father. He was the one who had built it. Camilla didn't back down. She doubled down, saying that was precisely the problem. It came from that manufacturer. Ernesta, with her usual nerve, didn't try to cool things down. She just looked at Saya and told her that if she really wanted an apology from Camilla, the place to demand it was inside the Phoenix Festa arena. Saya processed that in silence, turned to Ayato and asked if he'd be her tournament partner. Ayato didn't need much time to think, but before he could open his mouth, Julius had already stepped forward and answered for him. He wasn't available because he was already her partner. Period. End of discussion. Saya accepted it without making a scene, though it was clear that didn't mean she'd forgotten about it. Later on, while Ayato and Yabuki were talking about Alakant's research teams, the quiet hallway was broken by a sound they both recognized instantly, a sharp, clean slap. They went to check. What they found was a middle-aged man raising his hand over Kirin, ready to do it again. Ayato stepped in before the second hit landed and told the man, with a calm that hid nothing, that this wasn't what a real man does. The man, who turned out to be Koichiro Todo, Kirin's uncle, told him he had every right to discipline his niece however he saw fit. Ayato didn't move. Koichiro didn't either. And then came the deal. If Ayato could beat Kirin in a duel, he promised never to touch her again. Ayato looked at him, looked at Kirin, and accepted. The fight started, and from the very first exchange, it was obvious Kirin wasn't the kind of opponent you could read easily. Every move she made was precise, controlled, zero wasted energy.
Ayato felt it and recognized it for what it was. She noticed something in him, too, something she hadn't expected. And right in the middle of the duel, instead of pressing her advantage, she took a second to tell him he fought really well. No pressure, no sarcasm, she just said it. The duel ended and the result went to Kirin. Yulis arrived when it was already over, and when she found out what had happened, she gave Ayato a look that was equal parts relief that he was okay and frustration that he had ignored her instructions. She reminded him in a tone that left no room for debate that he had just gone up against the top-ranked student in his own academy, and doing it without telling her first hadn't exactly been a smart call. Meanwhile, Koichiro approached Kirin, and instead of acknowledging what he'd done, he spoke to her like she owed him everything she was. He told her that without his guidance, she never would have reached first place, and that if she ever wanted her goals to become reality, she'd better keep doing as she was told. Kirin didn't respond. She listened and went quiet in a way that had long stopped being submission. It was something else entirely. Later, Yulis walked into the common area and threw a towel at Ayato's face by way of greeting. She told him she was annoyed, but she couldn't deny she would have done the same thing if she'd seen someone raise a hand at a girl. What she did make clear was that losing that duel came at a cost. There were 3 people in all of Seidokan that Ayato currently couldn't beat. Claudia was one, Kirin was another, and the third was herself. She told him that if they were going to compete seriously, that needed to change. That same afternoon, Ayato stopped by Claudia's office to pick up a new badge. They took the chance to talk about Koichiro, and Claudia was straight with him. The man had been trying to get himself onto the Academy's executive board for a while, and he had no problem using his niece as a bargaining chip to make it happen. She also mentioned, almost in passing, that her own mother was on that board. Ayato looked at her. She kept talking like she hadn't said anything out of the ordinary. On the way back to the dorms, he ran into Kirin. She had been waiting for him to say thank you for what he'd done. Ayato walked with her for a stretch and asked what kept driving her to fight with that kind of intensity. Kirin paused, then answered. Her father was in prison. He had stepped in to defend her from a kidnapping when she was little, and because he was Ganestella, the charges didn't go away. He was convicted anyway. Kirin told him her uncle was the only person who had ever offered to help, and that's why she did what he asked, even when she didn't always agree. Ayato listened without cutting her off, and at the end said only one thing, that the day she started making her own choices, everything would fall into place. He suggested she join the training sessions with him and Yulis. Kirin thanked him, but explained her uncle had forbidden her from training with other people. Ayato thought about it and offered an alternative. Morning sessions, just the 2 of them, off the radar. Kirin accepted, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled without anyone asking her to.
2 seconds later, Saya dropped down from a tree with the energy of someone who had clearly been sitting there for a while. She put Ayato in a chokehold from behind and asked him without any preamble why he was flirting so openly with another girl. After letting him go, she repeated her tournament question. Ayato told her his partner was already chosen. Saya processed that and walked off to come up with a plan B. The next morning, Ayato and Kirin arrived at the training spot with no idea that from the shadows, Ernesta and Camilla were watching them with every piece of recording equipment they needed to break down every detail of their fight. What they also weren't expecting was the other problem. Gnolls appeared out of nowhere and attacked. Ayato cut through them, but the cuts were useless. The creatures regenerated almost instantly. Kirin assessed the situation fast and reached the conclusion before anyone else. You had to destroy the core, not the body. The moment she did it to one of them, the others scattered, but came back, and this time the ground beneath their feet started to give way. Ayato saw the terrain fracturing and tried to pull away from Kirin. She caught him in midair, but the spot she was standing on gave out too. They fell together, landing in the sewers, in the water, the echo of the impact still bouncing off the walls around them. And then, from the depths of that underground channel, something emerged, something considerably larger than anything that had been chasing them up above. An absurdly massive serpent launched itself straight at them.
Ayato looked at it, released everything he'd been holding back, and took it down in a single strike. Kirin watched and said nothing for a few seconds. She had never seen him use that level of force before. This wasn't the same person she'd fought in their duel. And then the chains appeared. The same ones that had shown up before, tightening around his body like a punishment for pushing too far. Ayato dropped unconscious before she could do anything. When he came to, Kirin was there. She explained what he already knew but had never said out loud. His combat time was capped at 5 minutes before his own body shut him down. Kirin took that in without asking unnecessary questions. Then it was her turn to speak, filling in the rest of her father's story with the details she'd left out before. After they were rescued, Kirin came face to face with her uncle. Koichiro warned her to stay away from Ayato. Kirin listened, looked at him, and told him that from that moment on, she'd be making her own decisions. She said goodbye. Koichiro threw threats into the air, but Kirin had already turned and walked away. A few days later, Ayato and Kirin faced off in a formal duel. Both of them gave everything. This time, when it ended, the result was different. Ayato won. In the locker room, while Julius was still congratulating him, Claudia arrived with Kirin. She had a question to ask Ayato directly. Could she join the training sessions with him and his team? Everyone agreed. The calm lasted until Koichiro appeared in the doorway. They let him in to hear what he had to say. He ordered Kirin to stop embarrassing him and return to training under his supervision. Kirin didn't move. Koichiro raised his voice and shifted from orders to threats. Claudia stepped forward, looked at him with the full coldness of someone who knows exactly what card she's holding, and informed him that if he didn't leave, her next conversation would be with her mother, who sat on the executive board. Koichiro left. Over at Alakant, Ernesta and Camilla were quietly going through every single frame of what they'd recorded during the serpent fight, analyzing, calculating, filing it away. The information they now had on Ayato was considerably more detailed than before. Back at Seda Khan, Saya walked up to Kirin with a no-nonsense proposal: be her partner for the Phoenix Festa. Kirin looked at her. Saya looked at her. The deal was sealed without needing another word. With the tournament getting closer by the day, the whole academy started buzzing with a different kind of energy. In the cafeteria, a student came up to Ayato asking for an autograph. He signed it without thinking much about it. Julius watched with a smile that had more teasing in it than warmth, and reminded him that climbing to the top spot came with social side effects. Yabuki added that he should enjoy it. That kind of fame had a short shelf life. Kirin, completely naturally, mentioned she was one of his fans. Julius turned her head and asked Kirin almost without thinking what they were going to do when they faced each other inside the arena. Saya answered before Kirin could open her mouth. They'd give it everything they had, like any serious team. Julius pointed out that wouldn't be so simple given that Saya and Kirin had only just started working together. Saya, unbothered, reminded her that Julius and Ayato were also a pretty new team. Ayato stepped in before breakfast turned into a full tactical debate and told all four of them that the most useful thing they could do was sharpen their teamwork before the tournament. Saya stood up and announced that she and Kirin weren't going to be joining the next day's training. They were going to spend it building their chemistry as a pair. She said it with complete confidence. The problem was that when the day actually came, neither of them had any idea what to do because neither had ever really had friends before, and the whole concept of just hanging out together was completely foreign to them. Kirin asked Saya what she wanted to do. Saya thought about it and said she needed to buy a birthday gift for her father. Kirin, who clearly had more real-world experience than Saya when it came to anything involving personal gifts, started making suggestions. Saya shut every single one down without giving them a chance. They ended up sitting on a bench in the mall, and Kirin asked Saya directly what her father was like. She described him as a scientist with more inventions than common sense. She was in the middle of explaining that every year on his birthday he gave her a new gun when something clicked in her head. She pulled out a map, slid it over to Kirin, and asked her to locate a specific store because her sense of direction was basically decorative. The store was in a part of the city that wasn't exactly the friendliest place for two academy girls. Kirin brought that up. Saya assured her it wasn't a problem. They got there. Saya scanned the place and picked out an old gun, nearly out of use. She asked the owner if the original generator was still intact. He said yes. Saya paid for it and they walked out. Kirin asked why that one and not something newer. Saya explained that even though the weapon was basic, the internal generator used the same construction logic as her father's work. It was a callback he'd understand better than anything wrapped in gift paper. Afterward, Kirin asked for something in return. She wanted to learn how to swim. Saya took her to the academy pool. Kirin asked why she hadn't just asked Ayato to teach her. Kirin immediately panicked, swallowed water, and nearly drowned on her first attempt. When she caught her breath, she admitted she wanted him to find out she knew how to swim only after it was too late for him to be the one teaching her. Saya absorbed that logic and decided not to question it. She left Kirin practicing while she went to grab drinks. In the meantime, Kirin accidentally bumped into a girl floating calmly in the pool. Kirin made it to the edge and apologized. The girl didn't accept the apology. She challenged her to a duel instead. Then she recognized who Kirin was and changed her entire posture in under a second, not before getting a shot in about how the top student of Seita didn't even know how to swim. Saya was back standing at the edge of the pool and threw a floaty at the girl, not gently. The girl demanded to know who she was. Saya introduced herself without ranks or titles because at that moment she didn't have any official ones. The girl saw that as an opening and challenged her too, introducing herself as Violet Wet. The duel started. Violet began explaining her techniques, pulled out her Lux reagent, and fired. The discharge sent Violet bouncing through the water until she stopped, unconscious, against the wall on the other side. End of duel. Saya and Kirin sat down at the edge of the pool. Saya told her plainly that she needed to learn to defend herself without depending on what her uncle approved or didn't approve of, that she'd spent so long following someone else's rules that she'd forgotten how to make her own decisions. Kirin listened and thanked her. Then she asked Saya why she had chosen her as a tournament partner. Saya was straight with her, because Kirin used the same fencing style as Ayato, and training against that style would make her sharper. Over the following sessions, Ayato and Julius watched Saya and Kirin from across the room, watching them move together, sync up, correct each other. What they saw brought them both to the same conclusion. Those two had improved faster than anyone expected. They looked at each other and agreed without much discussion that it was time to raise their own level. A few days before the tournament, deep in the basement of La Wolf Academy, the student council president, Durk Eberwein, opened the cell where Irene Zeiss had been locked away for some time. He told her she would be competing in the Phoenix Festa and that her objective was one thing only: knock Ayato out of the competition. He didn't care about the final result of the tournament, he just needed Ayato not to go far, because the Servaresta in his hands was a variable he wasn't willing to leave unchecked. Irene asked about her sister before saying anything else. Durk assured her she was fine. Irene processed that and agreed. The day of the Phoenix Festa arrived, the arena packed to the last seat. Ayato, Julius, Saya,
Kirin, and the rest of the competitors gathered in the competition area alongside a crowd that had been waiting weeks for this moment. During the opening ceremony, the committee announced a new rule. Teams would be allowed to use autonomous weapons in combat. The news sent murmurs rippling through the competitors. While waiting for their turn, Ayato and Julius went to find somewhere to eat. Saya and Kirin were nowhere to be found. Ayato spotted Lester not far off and tried to wave him over. Lester turned him down in his usual way, told him they weren't friends and to make sure he didn't lose before they faced each other, because that required him to still be standing. Shortly after, Saya and Kirin showed up with lunches they'd packed ahead of time. All 5 of them went to the waiting room together to eat. No big speeches, no dramatic promises, just the quiet calm of people who know what's coming and have already done everything they needed to do. When their turn came, Ayato and Julius stepped onto the stage. The announcers called out their rankings, and the crowd in the stands heated up immediately. Ayato felt the adrenaline of a big stage, something he hadn't experienced at this scale before. Julius beside him didn't blink. The signal went off. Their opponents charged straight at them, no setup, no apparent strategy. Julius had already seen it coming. She told Ayato quietly to take care of it and stepped to the side. Ayato took the opening she gave him, accelerated, and within seconds, both of their opponents' emblems hit the ground. The match ended before the crowd had even fully settled into their seats. The Phoenix Festa had just begun, and Ayato hadn't even shown half of what he was capable of. The stands didn't stop roaring for a second after the announcers declared Ayato and Julius the winners. While the echo of the applause was still shaking the ceiling of the arena, the two were already walking back to the waiting room. Julius reminded Ayato that the strategy had worked exactly as planned, and that it was critical to keep the variations going all the way to the end, not showing any more than necessary. They hadn't wasted a single extra hit. That was the edge they needed to protect. Inside, Yabuki was waiting for them. He'd come specifically to watch the next match, Alakant's. What nobody had anticipated was that the official Alakant representatives had been replaced by Ernesta's puppets.
Their opponents from Le Wolf weren't happy about feeling like they were being used as test material. To add insult to injury, the male puppets offered them a full 60-second head start before engaging, a kind of mechanical courtesy that was really just a statement of superiority. The Le Wolf team took it for exactly what it was and came out swinging from the opening signal. Combinations, constant pressure, no breaks. None of it worked. The puppets' defenses absorbed every hit like they were practice swings. When the minute was up, the puppets simply closed out the match in a matter of seconds. The crowd loved it. Ayato stared at the screen with a frown. Saya, beside him, noted quietly that the defensive barrier they'd just watched was going to be their biggest problem when it was their turn to face them. Right at that moment, Saya's phone rang. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. Her father, excited to the point of barely making sense, congratulating her for competing in a tournament where his inventions were getting worldwide exposure. After he finished being emotional, he reminded her almost in passing that he'd sent a new package to customs and that she should go pick it up. The call ended. Saya and Kirin got up and headed out to find the shipment. Yabuki took the chance to say he'd try to work his way into Alakant's interview area and see what he could pick up. Julius looked at Ayato and told him that instead of just sitting around waiting, they might as well use the time to train. Ayato didn't argue. A little while later, the two of them were heading back toward the arena when Julius stopped dead. A crowd had formed in a side street, not the kind that forms out of casual curiosity, but the kind that forms when something serious is going down. They pushed through and found Irene Erzais at the center, finishing off a group of guys who had clearly picked the wrong day to mess with her. When Irene spotted them, her eyes locked onto Ayato. She recognized him, same face as the file Durk had shown her. She moved straight toward him, and Julius stepped forward to cut her off. Irene told her to get out of the way. She had no unfinished business with her. Julius didn't move an inch and pointed out that going around beating people in the street during the Festa was a very efficient way to earn a suspension. Irene argued she'd only been defending herself. Julius replied that the rulebook didn't make that distinction. Irene sized her up for a second, and in not second, made a decision.
She threw out a duel challenge and drew her OrgaLux, a scythe, and the way she held it made it clear she knew exactly what to do with it. Ayato and Julius stepped back on instinct, keeping their distance. Irene smiled and told them they were smart to move. Then a voice came from behind her. Priscilla came running in, scolding her sister for causing the same scene all over again, and before Irene could respond, she apologized to Ayato and Julius for her sister's behavior. Then she turned toward Irene with a look that left no room for argument and made her apologize too. Irene did it with the grace of someone for whom every syllable costs something. Then they left. Julius pulled up Priscilla's file on her device. The information was minimal. She was Irene's tournament partner. Not much beyond that. Ayato asked if it hadn't been a little reckless to provoke someone of that caliber. Julius told him she'd done it with a purpose. She wanted to confirm that Irene had a specific reason for approaching him in particular, and Irene's reaction had given her the confirmation she needed. Lwolf was planning something, and Ayato was the target. Shortly after, the notification came through that Saya and Kirin's match had started. In the arena, each of them faced their opponents separately. Kirin's opponent ran a clean, precise martial arts style, but Kirin found the right angle and cut his emblem without needing more than one decisive exchange. Saya, for her part, used her gun not just to attack, but to absorb her opponent's hits, blocking with the body of the weapon until the opening she was looking for appeared. When she found it, she fired. Her opponent dropped on the spot. Victory for both of them. In the locker room afterwards, Saya walked out after her shower without a towel like it was the most natural thing in the world. Kirin went after her with one in hand, trying to hand it to her. Saya tried to use the moment to strike a pose with the little she had to show off. Kirin blocked every attempt with reflexes that had clearly gotten some practice, and when Saya finally gave up, she turned her attention to the door where Ayato and Julius were standing. Kirin said to ask them to wait a moment. Saya threw the door wide open. Kirin lost her towel at that exact instant. The scream she let out was sharp enough that they probably heard it in every other academy. 5 days later, the second round began. In Ayato and Julius's match, it was Julius who handled everything while Ayato watched. Their opponents tried to move, dodge, and reposition. Julius didn't give them the time.
One of them stumbled, trying to avoid a fireball, and left herself wide open. The second didn't last much longer. 2 consecutive victories, and the team still hadn't shown their real cards. The next match was Lester and Randy against Irene and Priscilla. Lester's strategy was to drag the fight out. Irene's weapon, the Graviscythe, consumed her own blood every time it released its full power, so the plan was to force her to wear herself down. Irene saw it coming from the first move. She ignored Lester and went straight for Randy, driving the scythe into the ground and activating a gravitational pull that pinned him to the floor like someone had multiplied his own weight by 10. Randy couldn't move. Lester tried to reach him, but Irene clipped him with the flat edge of the scythe and put him on the ground too. With Randy immobilized, Irene ramped up the gravitational pressure on him until he blacked out. Lester got back up, scrapped the patient strategy, and came at her with everything he had, enough to knock her down. Irene got back to her feet and told Lester that playtime was over. She walked over to Priscilla, leaned in, and began drinking from her neck with the ease of someone who had done it hundreds of times before. Priscilla didn't react with panic or pain. It was an agreement between the two of them. Priscilla's blood didn't just activate the full power of the Graviscythe, it also healed Irene's wounds in real time. When she straightened up, her eyes had a different depth to them. Lester noticed. The gravity orbs she launched after that weren't the kind you dodge. Lester tried anyway. It didn't last long. By the time he accepted the defeat, Irene had already put her weapon away. In the Cytocon box, Claudia congratulated Ayato on making it to the final stretch of the tournament and took advantage of the calm moment to rest her head on his shoulder with complete shamelessness. Before Ayato could figure out how to respond to that, his phone buzzed. It was Kirin. She explained she'd lost track of Saya, that she'd called her, and that Saya had answered saying she had no idea where she was, which was entirely believable given her track record with directions. Ayato apologized to Claudia, who sighed dramatically at the lost opportunity, and went out to find her. In a side street, he ran into Priscilla, running with the urgency of someone being chased. Ayato helped her take cover on the roof of a nearby building. When the danger passed, Priscilla explained that her sister had caused the usual chaos at a casino, and the people on the losing end decided to take it out on whoever was closest.
She mentioned she'd already called Irene to come. Ayato did the math on what that meant and had exactly 2 seconds to process that he was in a very uncomfortable situation. Irene showed up with her scythe out and an expression that was anything but friendly. Priscilla stepped in immediately and explained that Ayato had protected her. Irene argued that Priscilla was covering for him. Priscilla held her ground. Irene backed down, not enthusiastically. She lowered her weapon and asked Ayato what he was doing in that alley. Before he could answer, his phone rang. Saya and Kirin letting him know they were back together. Ayato confirmed everything was fine, hung up, and gave Irene the full version of what had happened. Irene listened, processed the fact that she owed him a favor, and said it exactly like that. She didn't like being in anyone's debt, and before they faced each other in the arena, she was going to settle it. She showed him the bracket for the next match. Both teams were on the same side of the draw. That same night, Irene literally walked through the walls of Durk's office, not figuratively, through the actual walls, and demanded answers about why the guards he had assigned to watch Priscilla hadn't stepped in when she was being chased. Durk looked at her without flinching and told her to calm down, that Priscilla was resilient and a few hits were nothing to her. Irene came at him with a closed fist. An invisible force stopped her before she made contact. She stepped back. She knew what that was. Durk explained with the patience of someone who enjoys having the upper hand that the agents watching Priscilla operated in the shadows precisely so they wouldn't be seen, and that if Ayato saw them act, the entire protocol would have been exposed. Irene accepted the explanation even if she didn't like it. She told him she was going to pay her debt to Ayato before the match. Durk didn't say anything that could be taken as an objection. The moment she left, he asked his assistant Corona to run the match projections. Corona analyzed the variables and told him that the sisters would have the advantage. Durk heard that, and something in his expression shifted towards something that looked almost like hope. He told her to call in the vice president. And then, almost as an afterthought, Ayato. Irene and Julius spent the time trading pointed remarks with the natural rhythm of two people who had rubbed each other the wrong way from the moment they met. The pace broke when Priscilla brought out the plates and everyone sat down. During dinner, Irene let it slip that her casino bets weren't for fun. They were out of necessity. Julius asked why she didn't just use the tournament winnings to cover whatever she needed. Irene waited for Priscilla to get up from the table on some pretext, then explained. Years ago, she had borrowed money from Durk, and the terms of the loan explicitly barred her from using Festa earnings to pay it back. It was a trap designed to keep her tied to him. The casino was the only loophole she had left. Julius pointed out that meant she entered the tournament for something beyond money. Irene admitted it flat out. She had entered because Durk had ordered her to.
Julius asked what Durk had against Ayato specifically. Irene answered that the serve arresta was a variable Durk couldn't calculate or control, and a weapon like that in the hands of someone with Ayato's potential represented exactly the kind of threat the LeWolf president wasn't willing to tolerate. After dinner, Priscilla walked Ayato and Julius to the exit. Once outside, she lowered her voice and told them she was glad she could do something for her sister because Irene fought for her. She paused, then added that the problem was all that sacrifice had been changing Irene from the inside, little by little, until the person she was now didn't quite resemble the person she used to be. Ayato listened and said nothing, but he held on to it. Priscilla had said it with genuine sadness, that her sister wasn't the same person anymore, that every time she picked up that scythe, something in her eyes shifted, as if the weapon was paying its debts at the cost of whoever held it. That image stayed with Ayato for the rest of the day. That night, he went to see Claudia. He had questions about the Graviscythe and wanted answers from someone who understood OrgaLux better than anyone. When he got to her room, he found her completely asleep. When he reached out to wake her, Claudia responded with a movement so fast and precise that Ayato barely had time to pull back. He came within inches of taking a sharp hit before she fully opened her eyes and registered what was happening. Claudia apologized immediately. Ayato told her it was his fault for walking in unannounced. Then he asked why her body reacted like that in her sleep. Claudia looked at him for a moment and made him an offer. If he wanted answers, he'd have to commit to joining her team for the next Griffin Festa. Ayato agreed without thinking twice. Then she told him the price of using her OrgaLux was reliving her own death in her dreams,
over and over, and by that point, she had accumulated over 1,200 dream deaths since she first picked up the weapon. That same night, somewhere else in the city, Irene was standing in an alley staring at the sky with an expression that had nothing calm about it. Behind her, the same thugs who had chased Priscilla were on the ground. Nobody had seen them go down. The next morning, before stepping onto the stage, Ayato proposed a change in strategy to Julius. He told her that this time he was going to show a little more. Julius looked at him and didn't know what to say. Claudia assured him she was fine, with the same calm someone uses to say they prefer their coffee black. Then she answered his original question. The OrgaLux Irene carried didn't just consume blood to function. Over time, the weapon and the user stopped being separate things. Julius processed that, evaluated it, and told him he could do whatever he wanted as long as the result was a win. Deal. When the match started, Ayato let the chains drop for the first time in front of the general public. The energy he released changed the atmosphere of the entire arena in a single second. Julius entered at the same time from the opposite flank, launching flame discs at Irene to split her attention. Irene deflected them without losing sight of Ayato, blocking his advance with a precision that made it clear why she ranked where she did. The three of them exchanged strikes for several minutes, with Irene setting the pace and holding her own against both of them without losing her footing. Irene acknowledged out loud that for a newly formed team, they moved with a level of sync that wasn't normal. Then she tried to trap Ayato inside a gravitational field. Julius called it out with half a second to spare, enough for him to dodge. Immediately after, Julius directed her attack toward Priscilla, forcing Irene to break the field and throw up a barrier to shield her sister before the flames landed. To recover energy, Irene moved close to Priscilla and fed from her. When she straightened back up, ready to keep going, she noticed Priscilla had dropped to her knees. Ayato caught it too and asked Irene if she really wanted to keep using her own sister as a power source. Irene told him it was none of his business and came at him hard. Ayato blocked the hit. Julius closed in from the other side. What Irene hadn't anticipated was that the two of them were working together to drive her into a specific position. Ayato kept pushing her back, she kept responding, and without realizing it, she was giving up ground, exactly toward the fire trap Julius had set up. When the detonation went off, everyone in the stands held their breath. When the smoke cleared, Irene was still standing, surrounded by gravity spheres she had thrown up as a shield at the last second. And then the weapon took over. Irene stopped being Irene. Her eyes changed, her movements changed. She turned toward Priscilla with an intent that had nothing gentle or sisterly left in it. Ayato didn't hesitate. He stepped in, put himself in the space between them, and started talking to her. No shouting, no fighting, just talking, reaching for the person still in there behind what the weapon had taken over. It worked, for a moment, but the Graviscythe was older and deeper than any words, and within seconds it reclaimed control. Ayato processed what had to be done, found the angle, and ripped the weapon from her hand, then channeled everything the Servaresta had left into a single strike. The Graviscythe split in two. Irene hit the ground unconscious. The announcers declared victory for Ayato and Julius, and 2 seconds later, Ayato went down too, completely drained, the chains tightening around him again. Julius came running to his side, but it was already too late to stop the spectators from seeing exactly what happened to him when he hit his limit. The secret of his time restriction was no longer a secret. In the hospital, Priscilla opened her eyes to find Irene sitting beside the bed, waiting. When her sister looked at her, Irene apologized. No setup, no excuses. Priscilla told her there was nothing to forgive, then added something she'd been holding on to, that she wanted to become strong enough so that in the next tournament she could stand beside Irene on the stage, not behind her as a backup power source. Irene didn't respond with words, but something in her expression was different from anything she had shown up to that moment. In the waiting area of the arena, Ayato opened his eyes and told Julius he'd be ready for the next match. Julius didn't fully believe him, but instead of arguing about it, she said something she usually didn't say, that they were a team and that if he needed to lean on her, he should do it without thinking twice. That's what she was there for. The moment lasted exactly until the door opened and Claudia, Saya, and Kirin all walked in at the same time. The three of them assessed Ayato's condition by their own standards and acted accordingly. Saya pulled his head toward her. Kirin snatched him back and pressed him to her side. Julius stepped in and pulled him out from between them. Claudia used the chaos to announce that since she didn't have a match that day, she could personally take charge of looking after him, and pulled him toward her. Ayato managed to break free from all of them because he literally needed air. From outside the room, Yabuki listened to the whole thing with the smile of someone who had been enjoying the show for a while, quietly wondering what new version of chaos the next round would bring. Miles away, in the private box of the 7th institution, Gallardworth, Fawn Shenglo followed the tournament on screen with narrowed eyes and a cup of tea in her hand. 9 years old, student council president of the largest academy in Asterisk, and considered by those who knew her to be the most powerful Genistella alive, she told her companion that she found Ayato interesting. Not the interesting you say to be polite, but the kind that means she was already calculating something. At that moment, Li Shentian and Li Shengkan, the twins from the Guanglong team, arrived to inform her that they would give everything against her pupils Song and Lu in their respective matches. Fawn listened and told her that it wasn't entirely certain that Song and Lu would even make it to that stage, because first they had to get through Ayato and Julius. And even though the entire stadium had now seen Ayato's time restriction, Fawn was convinced that boy still had something left to show. Julius had come to the same conclusion as the rest of the world.
Information about Ayato's limit was spreading through the competing teams like water through paper. What frustrated her wasn't that they knew, it was the tactical implications of them knowing. Ayato told her not everything was lost. He could fight defensively without activating the Servaresta for as long as needed, and when the moment called for it, he could unleash everything one more time. Euless processed that and started building the plan around that variable. They drew Song and Lu, two competitors from the Ji-Long Institute, whose coordination and raw power put them in a different category from any opponent they'd faced before. Before the signal went off, Euless quietly marked a specific point on the arena floor and told Ayato under her breath that when the moment came, he needed to be standing exactly there. The match started. Lu went straight at Ayato, reading his responses, confirming within the first 30 seconds that he wasn't operating at full capacity. She relayed that to Song with a glance, and both of them converged on him to close it out fast. Ayato planted himself at the marked point. Euless responded from behind by raising a wall of fire that split the arena into two perfect halves. Song was on her side, Lu was on Ayato's. With the field divided, Euless ran her duel against Song on her own terms. Ayato held Lu back without releasing the Servaresta, absorbing every charge, responding just enough to stay on his feet. Lu kept pushing the intensity gradually, and at some point reached the conclusion that if Ayato were at 100%, she would have lost a long time ago. She decided to honor that and came at him with her best attack. On the other side of the wall, Song had been pressing Euless. A landed hit made her drop her guard for just a second too long. Euless saw it. That was the exact opening she needed. She fired a signal, a fireball aimed at the center of the wall. Ayato saw it. Euless opened a gap in the wall. Both of them crossed through at the same time, swapping opponents in a move nobody saw coming. Song found herself face to face with Ayato and the Servaresta fully lit up. Lu found herself face to face with Euless at exactly the wrong distance. Two emblems hit the ground almost simultaneously. On their way out of the arena, they ran into Song and Liu. Both of them stopped, looked at Ayato and Julius, and gave a respectful nod. Not an empty formality, but the acknowledgement of people who've fought hard and know when they've been outmatched. But before leaving, Song turned to Ayato and Julius with a warning that came from experience. That trick of splitting the field wasn't going to work against the Shen twins. Those two lived in illusion and misdirection. They'd see through any pre-planned strategy before it even finished executing. Ayato filed that away. So did Julius. That night, Julius ran the math out loud. 3 more wins and the Phoenix Festa was theirs. She asked Ayato what wish she had in mind for when they won, because the prize was what they'd been chasing from the beginning. Ayato said he hadn't fully figured it out yet. Julius didn't push, but gently suggested using that opportunity to ask about Haruka's whereabouts, that the Academy might have access to information that wasn't in any public record.
Before the conversation could go deeper, a message came in from Kirin and Saya. There was someone waiting for Julius in her room. When they opened the door, a green-haired girl was standing there with an expression somewhere between nervous and excited. Flora. Julius recognized her immediately, and her whole posture shifted. Softer, more open. She explained to Ayato that Flora was a lady-in-waiting she was training from the royal palace of Sultania, and that she had traveled all the way there to watch her win the tournament with her own eyes. Ayato asked Flora what Julius was actually like at home, in the palace, away from everything she showed at the academy. Flora smiled and said she had always been kind. She treated everyone well, remembered people's names, never made anyone feel less important. She pulled out a small photo album full of everyday moments from the palace. Julius explained that Flora had picked up the habit of photographing everything from a nun at the orphanage who did the same thing to preserve the memories of the girls who lived there. Flora mentioned she wanted to enroll at the academy someday, become strong, be able to help others the way Julius did. Julius looked at her with a tenderness very few people had ever seen from her and told her to first learn who she was, that courage came after that, not before. That night, Ayato got a call from Priscilla at the hospital. She thanked him for what he'd done during the match, that destroying the Gravy Scythe hadn't just been winning a fight, but giving her sister back something the weapon had been taking from her for years. Ayato told her he was glad they were both okay. When Irene took the phone, there was a long pause before she said anything. Then, in a voice that clearly wasn't used to that tone, she thanked him, directly, no detours, no disguising it as something else, with her cheeks visibly red even though nobody could see her. Before hanging up, Ayato asked her for a favor. Help him set up a meeting with Durk. Irene warned him not to underestimate the man, that he had resources and forces operating in the shadows that weren't visible from the outside. Ayato heard her out and said he still wanted to talk to him. Ayato fell asleep with his thoughts on Haruka, like almost every night since he'd arrived at the academy. The next morning, Yabuki was already in his room when he opened his eyes. They sat down to go over the next opponents, and Yabuki explained that the Shen twins ran a technique called Star Senjutsu, a combat method that let them channel their Genestala power with a stability and precision that took most fighters years to develop. It wasn't just raw strength, it was control over one's own energy taken to a completely different level. Then came the message from Julius. Flora wanted to invite them to lunch and ask Ayato a few questions. Yabuki recommended a spot he knew well, and they agreed to meet there 2 hours later. At the restaurant, Flora demolished her food at a speed that didn't match her size, then pulled a small journal from her bag. Before she could get to the point, her eyes landed on the massive parfait the waiter had just brought to the table next to them. She looked at it, looked at her journal, looked back at the parfait. With very deliberate hesitation, she raised her hand and ordered one too. Ayato looked at Julius with a smile and told her she was very considerate with her. Julius replied that she simply didn't have the heart to say no to a kid. Flora, without lifting her eyes from the dessert, added that Julius also sent money to the orphanage every month, and that since she started doing it, things had gotten considerably better for all the girls living there. Corona approached the table where Ayato and Julius were finishing their meal and asked if she could steal 2 minutes of Ayato's time. She let him know there was someone outside who wanted to talk with him. Ayato looked at Julius and asked her to wait. Julius did not take the suggestion of staying behind well and made it clear she was coming too. Corona relayed the message. Durk, from inside his car, responded that Julius was welcome. They got in. The vehicle was exactly the kind of thing someone buys when they need the whole world to know how much money they have. Durk looked at both of them and started with Ayato, dropping comments that made it obvious he was underestimating him without actually knowing anything about him. Julius cut him off before he could gain momentum and reminded him with sharp calm that he'd had to send an intermediary to do his dirty work instead of showing his face himself. Ayato asked Julius to let the adults talk.
Durk looked at him differently after that. They got to the point. Ayato told him he wanted everything he knew about Haruka. Durk considered it and spoke. He had heard her name only once, in the context of the Eclipse Festa. Julius explained for anyone who didn't know, the Eclipse wasn't a tournament with rules or institutions backing it. It was an underground event built by people who wanted to see real blood, where matches didn't end until someone lost consciousness or stopped breathing. It had existed for years until it was dismantled.
Durk confirmed that Haruka had competed there wielding the Serveresta, and that despite her level, she had been defeated. What he didn't know was whether she had died that day or not, because after the eclipse he never heard from her again. Her trail disappeared along with the tournament. Ayato processed every word in silence. Durk, satisfied that he'd held up his end, changed the subject and asked Ayato if he knew someone named Mariath Mesa. Ayato answered that he was the chairman of the Festa organizing committee. Durk noted that was all the information he had and immediately lost interest in the conversation. He told them they could get out. Julius, before opening the door, turned and asked how he had found them at that restaurant if the decision to go there had been made barely 2 hours earlier. Durk smiled and didn't answer. The car pulled away. As it drove off, Corona mentioned almost to herself that she had spotted a girl in a maid's uniform sitting with Julius at the restaurant. Durk heard it and said nothing, but something in his expression shifted. That night, Ayato dreamed of the dojo. Haruka was in front of him, moving with that precision that made defending against her feel like trying to stop water with your bare hands. In the background, a much younger Saya sat on the floor watching them. After training, Ayato and Saya agreed to work together on how to eventually beat Haruka. Ayato, in a gesture he clearly hadn't thought all the way through, gave her a favor ticket as payment for her effort. In the present, Ayato was in the training room with Julius, and missing strikes he normally wouldn't miss. His mind was somewhere else entirely, still processing everything Durk had told him. Julius lowered her weapon, looked at him, and went straight to it. She told him she believed Ayato wasn't searching for his sister with everything he had, because deep down he was terrified of finding something he didn't want to know, that the fear of the truth sometimes weighs more than the truth itself. Ayato didn't respond. That same night, Saya showed up in his room without warning, sat down in front of him, and asked without any particular tact what was wrong, because he'd been moping around for days like the world had ended. She asked if he thought Haruka had left him on purpose. Ayato took a while to answer. Saya didn't wait. She told him that was ridiculous, that if Haruka had disappeared without contacting him, something had stopped her, not because she wanted to leave. And if that was true, the last thing he needed was to stay paralyzed. Then she pulled something out of her pocket, the favor ticket, still with Ayato's handwriting from years ago. She cashed it in right then and there. She asked him to take her back to the memory of that day in the dojo. Ayato walked through it mentally. He and Saya had teamed up to go at Haruka together, coordinated, giving her no breathing room. They'd worked well, better than expected, so well that Haruka had barely been able to handle both of them, and even then they hadn't landed a clean hit on her. Haruka, to acknowledge their effort, showed them a glimpse of what she was truly capable of. She sent them crashing into each other with a single move, and the duel ended there. Afterward, Haruka explained what she had used, a technique called Evil Vanisher, which sharpened perception to the point of anticipating an opponent's movements before they happened, seeing the fight 3 steps ahead. Saya reminded him that they had never been able to beat her, but that when they found her, they'd try again, and not time with more to work with. Before getting up to leave, Saya left him with one last thing, that he didn't have to carry it alone, that there were people around him ready to help if he'd let them. Julius broke down how the twins operated. Li Shengyun and Li Shenhua built their entire game around exploiting an opponent's weaknesses. They analyzed, applied pressure at the exact point where it hurt most, and finished it right there. The only real weakness Ayato had was his time window with the Serveresta. That meant the twins were going to structure their entire attack around that limit. Julius said that if they could anticipate the twins' patterns before that happened, they'd have a shot. When all 4 of them stepped onto the stage, the twins opened the match the only way they knew how, getting inside their heads. Calculated comments, pointed looks, deliberate insinuations designed to destabilize before the first strike was even thrown. Ayato ignored it and went straight in. The twins evaded without engaging head-on, giving up ground, buying time, letting the clock run. Then they flooded the arena with a thick fog that wiped out all visibility. The crowd started booing. The twins pulled it back, not out of consideration, but because they needed people to watch them win. One of them summoned an army of clones, multiplying until Ayato couldn't tell which one was real. While they kept him occupied with the chaos of the copies, the other turned completely invisible and went straight for Julius. The two of them were pushed, worn down, and separated, and then Ayato's time ran out. He went down. While he was on the ground, Shenyun approached to close the match with a statement. Ayato caught the angle, pulled out a second sword, and cut her emblem. But the relief lasted 1 second. It wasn't the real one. He had been fighting copies the entire time. His body wasn't responding the way it should, and talismans started raining on him from every direction. Julius arrived in time and blocked them. She stepped in front of him and said something she usually didn't say out loud, that she was always there for everyone else, but he never let anyone be there for him, that this was her turn to cover him. Something about those words landed differently. Ayato felt something inside him settle. He got up and asked if she could buy him time. Julius didn't ask what for. She said yes and launched herself alone against both of them. What followed was Julius fighting both sisters simultaneously while also protecting Ayato at her back. But the twins were too many variables for one person, and they gradually cornered her, immobilized her, and instead of ending the match there, they started setting off talismans in her face one by one, deliberately leaving her emblem intact to draw out the punishment. At that moment, Ayato wasn't in the arena. He was inside something that felt like a space between thoughts, where the chains binding him had a visible shape. He found one, grabbed it, heard Saya's voice telling him he wasn't alone, heard Kirin's voice telling him she trusted him, and he broke the first seal. He returned to the stage like he'd floored the accelerator from a dead stop, freed Julius before the next talisman could reach her, and quickly explained that he'd only opened one seal.
But that it gave him considerably more room than he'd had before. Julius processed that, told him the rest was his, and dropped to the ground completely drained. Ayato activated Evil Vanisher. The entire arena became legible. He saw the hidden talismans as if they were lit up, saw the invisible twin as if she'd never disappeared. He went for the first one, took her out in seconds, and the second responded by turning every remaining talisman into a massive bomb. The result was a chain of explosions that would have ended the match under any normal circumstances. Ayato cut through all of them before they detonated, then went for the second twin and closed it out. The stands erupted. Feng Xinlu from her private box watched the finish with her eyes open just a little wider than usual. She said quietly that it had been worth watching. Outside the arena, Claudia congratulated Julius on making the semifinals and immediately took Ayato by the arm with the intention of taking him back to her room for what she described, with a very specific smile, as supervised recovery. Julius blocked her path and said that before anything else, they had strategy to go over for the next day. Claudia sighed. Julius didn't move. Elsewhere, Saya and Kirin were preparing for their own match. Before walking into the arena, Saya thanked Kirin for making it that far with her, and then told her something very few people knew, that her father had lost most of his body in a lab accident, and that he now lived connected to the central core of his workshop, unable to move but with all the mental freedom in the world to keep inventing. That every weapon Saya carried was something he had built specifically for her to use. That's why what Camilla had said about him wasn't just a technical insult, it touched directly on what her father had sacrificed. On their way to the arena, they ran into Ernesta and Camilla. Camilla looked them over and after a pause admitted she had reconsidered her evaluation of the weapons, that they now seemed right for Saya, even if she added without losing her tone that in general combat they still had limitations, but she promised to bring out her puppets so they could be properly introduced in the arena. The match started, and the Alakant team offered the same 1-minute grace period as always. Kirin didn't wait for the minute to end. She went straight at ARD and landed a hit that left him without words. ARD, genuinely surprised, asked how she'd done it. Kirin explained it with complete honesty, because that's what her style was built on. The puppet was programmed to follow a pattern, and any variation in attack rhythm left it outside its calculations. On the other side of the stage, Saya faced off against RMC, the female puppet, in a long-range duel where both of them matched the other's output hit for hit. The tactical stalemate held as neither gave up ground. In the stands, someone approached Flora while the match was underway. When Saya and Kirin looked for her again, the seat was empty.
ARD, meanwhile, had accumulated enough data on Kirin's style to begin evolving in real time, adapting its response to every variation she introduced. The pressure on her kept building. Kirin changed her patterns. ARD learned them. The cycle accelerated. At one point, ARD decided it had enough of a foundation to unleash its true potential. RMC suggested waiting, that it wasn't the right moment to play that card yet. Saya, seeing Kirin's situation getting tighter, decided to escalate. She switched to maximum fire output and dumped everything she had into RMC. RMC responded with its cannon at full power. Both systems collided in the center of the arena. When the impact cleared, RMC was still standing, damaged but functional. Then the puppets regrouped. RMC detached parts of its own body and transferred them to ARD, which adopted a completely new configuration. Faster, lighter, with the combined energy of both systems running through it. Ernesto watched with something close to the pride of someone watching an experiment they designed from scratch work exactly as intended. Saya identified the weak point before Kirin even had to tell her. The connection between ARD and the damaged parts of RMC was the fragile link in that new form. She just needed Kirin to buy her time to cool the cannons down and find the angle. The problem was that ARD swept the floor with Kirin before that time could be created. Saya stepped forward and fired with everything she had left. The cannons started failing from the accumulated heat. She pulled out a secondary weapon and kept going. ARD looked at her with something that, in a machine, might have been called respect. Kirin got back up. Both of them made their final move together. It wasn't enough. One explosion destroyed both emblems at the same time. Ayato and Julius were running to Saya and Kirin's room the moment they heard the result. Julius promised that what they hadn't been able to finish, she would close out in the final. Saya looked at her and said, without any drama, that she didn't see how anyone could beat those puppets with what they had, but wished them luck anyway, and in her tone there was something closer to confidence than resignation. Claudia walked in shortly after, congratulated both of them on reaching the top 4 of the Phoenix Festa, and explained the impact that would have on the Academy in terms of resources and reputation. The room was calm, until Julius's phone rang with Flora's number. She answered. The voice on the other end wasn't Flora. The kidnapper was clear. He wanted Ayato to request the emergency sealing of the serveresta in exchange for Flora coming home safe. If anyone contacted the authorities before he hung up, the girl would face the consequences. The call cut. The silence left behind in the room was the heavy kind. Claudia explained what everyone needed to understand. Emergency sealing in OrgaLux isn't just temporarily disabling it, it's permanently severing the bond between the weapon and its wielder. If Ayato did it, the serveresta would never recognize him again. The plan they put together was fast and surgical: comply with the kidnapper on the surface, work in parallel to rescue Flora before the seal became irreversible, and have Claudia use all her contacts inside the system to slow down the bureaucratic process as long as possible. Ayato signed the request. The clock started running. Claudia estimated that Durk was the mind behind the operation, and if that was the case, the resources he had available were considerable but not limitless. That narrowed down where Flora could be. Kirin and Saya went out to sweep the area while Ayato and Julius prepared for the semifinal, with a replacement weapon and the weight of knowing there was a little girl being held somewhere in the city because someone wanted to neutralize Ayato before the final. In the semifinals, their opponents were Forrester and Lame, 2 veterans with years of experience in international tournaments. Julius didn't sugarcoat it. The combination of their experience, the absence of the serveresta, and the mental pressure of what was happening with Flora was not an ideal scenario for either of them. When the match started, Julius went after Lame. He summoned a full suit of armor around his body and mounted an energy warhorse to charge straight at her with everything he could generate. Julius read him perfectly. If Lame depended on the constant charge, heat was his natural enemy. She raised a wall of fire in his path. Lame crashed through it mid-gallop, and the accumulated heat did the rest. When he collapsed, Julius closed the match without ceremony. On the other side of the stage, Saya faced off against RMC, the female puppet, in a long-range duel where both of them matched the other's output hit for hit. The tactical stalemate held as neither gave up ground. In the stands, someone approached Flora while the match was underway. When Saya and Kirin looked for her again, the seat was empty. ARD, meanwhile, had accumulated enough data on Kirin's style to begin evolving in real time, adapting its response to every variation she introduced. The pressure on her kept building. Kirin changed her patterns. ARD learned them. The cycle accelerated. At one point, ARD decided it had enough of a foundation to unleash its true potential. RMC suggested waiting, that it wasn't the right moment to play that card yet. Saya, seeing Kirin's situation getting tighter, decided to escalate. She switched to maximum fire output and dumped everything she had into RMC. RMC responded with its cannon at full power. Both systems collided in the center of the arena. When the impact cleared, RMC was still standing, damaged but functional. Then the puppets regrouped. RMC detached parts of its own body and transferred them to ARD, which adopted a completely new configuration. Faster, lighter, with the combined energy of both systems running through it. Ernesto watched with something close to the pride of someone watching an experiment they designed from scratch work exactly as intended. Saya identified the weak point before Kirin even had to tell her. The connection between ARD and the damaged parts of RMC was the fragile link in that new form. She just needed Kirin to buy her time to cool the cannons down and find the angle. The problem was that ARD swept the floor with Kirin before that time could be created. Saya stepped forward and fired with everything she had left. The cannons started failing from the accumulated heat. She pulled out a secondary weapon and kept going. ARD looked at her with something that, in a machine, might have been called respect. Kirin got back up. Both of them made their final move together. It wasn't enough. One explosion destroyed both emblems at the same time. Ayato and Julius were running to Saya and Kirin's room the moment they heard the result. Julius promised that what they hadn't been able to finish, she would close out in the final. Saya looked at her and said, without any drama, that she didn't see how anyone could beat those puppets with what they had, but wished them luck anyway, and in her tone there was something closer to confidence than resignation. Claudia walked in shortly after, congratulated both of them on reaching the top 4 of the Phoenix Festa, and explained the impact that would have on the Academy in terms of resources and reputation. The room was calm, until Julius's phone rang with Flora's number. She answered. The voice on the other end wasn't Flora. The kidnapper was clear. He wanted Ayato to request the emergency sealing of the Serveresta in exchange for Flora coming home safe. If anyone contacted the authorities before he hung up, the girl would face the consequences. The call cut. The silence left behind in the room was the heavy kind. Claudia explained what everyone needed to understand. Emergency sealing in OrgaLux isn't just temporarily disabling it, it's permanently severing the bond between the weapon and its wielder. If Ayato did it, the Serveresta would never recognize him again. The plan they put together was fast and surgical.
Comply with the kidnapper on the surface, work in parallel to rescue Flora before the seal became irreversible, and have Claudia use every contact she had inside the system to slow down the bureaucratic process as long as possible. Ayato signed the request. The clock started running. Claudia estimated that Durk was the mind behind the operation, and if that was the case, the resources he had available were considerable but not limitless. That narrowed down where Flora could be. Kirin and Saya went out to sweep the area while Ayato and Julius prepared for the semifinal, with a replacement weapon and the weight of knowing there was a little girl being held somewhere in the city because someone wanted to neutralize Ayato before the final. In the semifinals, their opponents were Forrester and Lame, 2 veterans with years of experience in international tournaments. Julius didn't sugarcoat it. The combination of their experience, the absence of the Serveresta, and the mental pressure of what was happening with Flora was not an ideal scenario for either of them. When the match started, Julius went after Lame. He summoned a full suit of armor around his body and mounted an energy warhorse to charge straight at her with everything he could generate. Julius read him perfectly. If Lame depended on the constant charge, heat was his natural enemy. She raised a wall of fire in his path. Lame crashed through it mid-gallop and the accumulated heat did the rest. When he collapsed, Julius closed the match without ceremony. On the other side, Forrester faced Ayato and immediately noticed he wasn't carrying his usual weapon. He said it out loud, visibly disappointed, as if that had ruined his plan to make history that day. He still came in with intent. It lasted exactly as long as it took Ayato to read his first move. The emblem hit the ground before Forrester had finished processing what had happened. Semifinals done. The final was theirs. Ayato called Saya the second they stepped off the stage. Nothing. No lead, no trail, no solid direction.
Ayato and Julius joined the search without hesitation. Saya, when she heard they'd already won their match, let out a single tear she didn't manage to hold back before wiping it away and getting back to work. 18 hours left until the final, and Flora was still nowhere. Yabuki arrived to congratulate them, read the room in 2 seconds, and dropped the celebration entirely. He heard the full situation, confirmed it pointed to Durk, and said that while fighting wasn't his thing, he had other ways to help. He left without elaborating. That night, Ayato changed into something that in theory wouldn't identify him and headed into the redevelopment district to ask around. It didn't take long for him to be spotted. 2 men in dark suits recognized him from across the street and started closing in. Ayato turned and ran into the alleyways, losing them around the corners. He was mapping out an exit when a girl appeared out of nowhere in front of him, extended her hand, and told him to trust her. They ran together for several minutes until the sound of footsteps behind them disappeared. The girl explained that the district was hotter than usual because there was a minor operation active in the area, which had the entire local criminal network running in paranoia mode. She advised him to stay away from organized groups for a while, then called him by name. Ayato tensed up. She caught it and clarified immediately that she had no hostile intentions, that his name was everywhere since the tournament started, and that his disguise was, with all due respect, a disaster. Before he could respond, a heavy-set man appeared from an alley and told Ayato to come with him. When he noticed the girl, his whole tone shifted and the situation escalated several levels in seconds. The girl didn't move. She recited the man's full name, his background, his academy, and his ranking with the precision of someone who had memorized a living encyclopedia. The man registered the name he'd just heard and processed what that meant. Ayato moved to step in front of her on instinct. He didn't need to. The man tried to push forward anyway and found out firsthand that the girl didn't need anyone covering for her. The conflict ended quickly and without much drama. When everything settled, the girl looked at Ayato and told him she could see he was looking for someone, that she could help him if he gave her a description. Ayato showed her a photo of Flora. She studied it, asked him to open a map, and made him promise that what she was about to show him wouldn't leave there. When Ayato agreed, the girl closed her eyes, and her entire presence changed. When she opened them, Ayato recognized her instantly. Sylvia Leinheim, #1 ranked at Gallardworth, global idol, living legend, and the person whose voice was literally capable of altering reality through song. She had been there the whole time in a different appearance. She pointed to a spot on the map without hesitating. Before she left, Ayato asked if he could have her contact. Sylvia looked at him and laughed, told him that sounded a lot like a pickup line. She gave him her private number anyway, one that didn't reach many people, and mentioned she'd been wanting to meet him for a while, ever since she first saw him fight. After she disappeared into the crowd, Ayato called the team with the location. Saya told him to get back to the academy and prepare for the final, that Flora was their job. Durk received a notification of suspicious activity near where they were holding Flora. He called Agent 7 and gave a clear instruction. If the situation became uncontrollable before it could be contained, eliminate the variable. He ended the call. Saya, Kirin, and Yabuki arrived at the building. Yabuki used what he did best, and the door opened without a sound. Inside, a contingent of shadow creatures was waiting, filling the space before they'd taken 3 steps. Kirin engaged them with her legs still hurting from the previous match. Saya cleared the field with the heaviest weapon she had available, draining almost all her ammo in a single pass. The shadows reformed. The back door burst open and Lester walked in with his axe, same energy as always. Yabuki had tipped him off. Lester didn't say much, he just went straight at the shadows and cleared the path for them. Kirin and Saya pushed down to the lower floors and found the room where Flora was being held. When Kirin entered, Agent 7 activated his technique. The shadows of the entire room became extensions of his control, attacking from every possible angle. Kirin analyzed it in seconds. The room was the problem, there was no safe angle, but the technique had a physical limit. It needed darkness to work. Saya came in through the other access and threw a flash grenade that turned the room into a pure white flare. The shadows dissolved. Kirin reached Flora, cut what was restraining her, and pushed her to Saya to get her out, then turned back towards Agent 7.
She fought with her leg failing under her, without complaint, without changing her stance. She dropped into the folded wing guard, one of the most advanced forms in her style, and Agent 7 saw in that instant exactly what was about to happen to him. Kirin cut both of his shoulders before he could reorient. Saya followed up from behind and the man went flying. Kirin hit the floor the moment the fight ended. The blood loss from the arena had finally collected its debt. Back in the arena, with the final already underway, Ayato and Julius were holding their own against ARD and RMC without the Servaresta. ARD had the full memory of every attack pattern Ayato had used in the previous match and was blocking it with mechanical precision. What it hadn't calculated was Julius attacking immediately after each block, forcing it to dodge manually instead of predicting. Then RMC remembered it existed and entered the fight. Ayato activated Evil Vanisher to anticipate their movements and cover Julius while responding at the same time. All four of them exchanged strikes for several minutes until Julius landed a clean hit on ARD. Its armor was too dense to bring down with direct attacks. Ayato told Julius to pull back while he found the right angle. ARD assessed the situation and made a decision: fusion. It called for RMC. Julius tried to interrupt the transformation, but RMC covered the process with an area attack that pushed her back. When ARD completed the fusion with RMC's components fully integrated into its frame, the entire dynamic of the match changed.